All right, and for our last talk of the day, we have Tarek presenting on cyber resilience.
Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk about cyber resilience. I'll be the first to admit it is used as a bit of a buzzword, so I'll try not to focus too much on that, but focus more on the concepts that are behind it. My name is Tarek Habib. I'm a senior manager in the security and resilience group in KPMG. Based out of Halifax, I studied here. I'm very happy to be back here. And most of my focus, half of my job is cybersecurity, the other half is business resilience. And the reason I put the quotes here is because it goes by a few different names, and we'll talk about what those are. I do have some certifications in these areas. I'm not going to bother reading all of them, but most of my work is focused on helping companies be more resilient, whether it's to not just cyber attacks, that's the most popular, most common type of disruption, but also to other types of disruptions, which we'll talk about. I know it's a security conference, so we're not supposed to have QR codes, but I promise you that one goes to my LinkedIn page, and I'll have it again at the end. So the first thing I wanted to start with is just some context. We hear about these buzzwords. We have business resilience, cyber resilience, anything resilience. We have even personal resilience as humans. And there are a few related terms. So in the old days, it used to be called business continuity management. Now the more common term is business resilience. And it's all about making sure that your business can roll with the punches. There are other terms. So business continuity planning is, let's say, a subset of it. That's one type of plan that you would develop, and I'll talk about the types of plans in a bit. And then there's also the concept of operational resilience, which is not exactly the same thing. So I won't get into that, but I just wanted you to know that there's a slight difference between those. In government circles, continuity of operations is a popular alternative term. But all of this is to say, I want to make sure that my business can survive almost no matter what happens to it. On the other side, cyber resilience is a subset of it. And there's probably no single definition for what it is, but the way that I would look at it is making sure that my business survives no matter what cyber issues happen. And most of it is focused on my systems, my data not being breached as a business, but also the third parties that I depend on. Sometimes that's forgotten about. If that third party is breached and can't operate, what do I do? And so that's the focus of cyber resilience. It's a bit of a subset that really focuses on that scenario. If you do risk assessments, you'll know that there are so many different types of risks, issues, the type events that could happen that could impact your business. One way to group them is deliberate threats, such as cyber attacks, accidental threats, such as something catching fire, my data center catching fire, or natural hazards, such as a snowstorm or a flood taking out my data center, for example. There are a ton of examples. The distinction here is that the most common disruption, the most frequently occurring one that I see is cyber attacks. All of these different things, fires happen, bad weather happens, but if you look at the news and what's happening around us, the most frequent issue, disruption that you find in the news is this company was hit with a cyber attack. And so that's why I wanted to focus on it, and that's where the field of cyber resilience comes in. Some recent local examples. So how many hurricanes have we had that were very disruptive, major hurricanes that we've had in the last, let's say, 5 years? You can count them on one or two hands. Communications disruptions, not being able to use our mobility services for a day or two. How many supply chain issues have we had with global conflicts, the pandemic? You can count those, or the supply chain one is more of a slower burn. But then when you think about cyber attacks and how often that happens, the other distinction and these things all happen to all the companies around us, whether it's in Atlantic Canada, anywhere across the world, no company is immune to any of these types of disruptions. The specific thing with cyber attacks, though, is it's specific to one company, or typically specific to one company and its customers if it's a service provider. And the reason I wanted to point that out is you get less of a pass if you're the company that's impacted. So if there's a communications outage, if there's a hurricane that swept through your province, you get a bit of a pass, or most companies would get a bit of a pass on why you're not open the next day or the next day or two, unless you're a hospital or military, But if it's a cyber attack, you're the only company, the only organization that's impacted, so there's a lot more focus and there's a lot less sympathy, which magnifies the impact of that kind of disruption. Same with, like I was saying, if you do risk assessments, you know that there are so many different types of impacts that you can assess. There's the disruption of operations or services, financial costs, reputation. But you can look at them in terms of, if we talk about cyber attacks or disruptions, the most immediate one that's felt is not necessarily the reputational harm. That happens a bit over time, or the negative effects come over time. But the most immediate one, and the one that the resilience field deals with the most, is being able to resume services. And so we start from that side and then slowly try to work our way through the other categories. Because we're talking about cyber attacks, half of the battle is how does my business continue to operate while my systems are down, while the investigation is happening? And the other half of the battle is how do I rebuild those systems and get back to operation? And the reason cyber attacks are so disruptive is because there are extra steps that slow you down during the recovery. So there's a concept of disaster recovery, and I don't know why this term caught on, like why disaster. But disaster recovery is typically used to refer to rebuilding your IT systems from backups, for example. I don't know, it's not the same as natural disasters. I don't know who picked the term disaster, but technology disaster recovery is the most accepted name for recovering your IT systems. I have two scenarios for you. We're going to talk about the scenario of disruption, and I'm really happy that we have all of these screens because this is the only slide that I have with small font. But we're going to talk about two scenarios. The more traditional scenario where a data center catches fire, or a fire impacts your assets. And then the second scenario, and what the recovery looks like in a ransomware attack. And then they both end up with a common objective of having your systems recovered. In a traditional scenario, fire happens, you have to evacuate people, declare disaster, get the fire warden, whoever, stabilize the situation. That takes a little bit of time. Depending on whether or not you have infrastructure or assets in a separate data center, it may take you time to go procure assets, to go spin up a cloud environment. So that could cause a little bit of delay. But you can directly go start doing that. So as the building is being evacuated, somebody on the other side or in a different office can start working on that recovery. Then there's the backup retrieval. So I have to go get my backups. That might take time if I'm transferring the backups between sites and the data is pretty big. That takes a little bit of time. And then the users have to verify that the data, the systems were loaded correctly. That takes a little bit of time. But when we talk about cyber attacks, the unfortunate part is that there are extra steps up front that have to be done to make sure that what I'm recovering can be trusted, and that takes more time. And the tough part there is a lot of businesses think, well, we can recover in 4 hours. But if we think about the steps that happen, the very first thing is figuring out what just happened. So quarantining the asset, making sure that we draw a circle around the assets that were impacted, investigation. So sometimes it takes some time to get the forensics people to start their job. So you can't really begin your recovery until you have someone that helps you understand, well, how far back does the cyber attack go? That forensic investigation can take time. And a lot of the time those assets, that environment is reserved for that investigation. They still want to check a few things before they give it back to you to blow away everything and recover from backups. You also have to assess how far back do I go on the backups, and that takes time as well, because you have to know how far back the breach goes. And then we get back to the common path of, now I have to go retrieve the backups, load them, re-enter any data, and so on. And so you see those extra steps that happen in the case of a cyber attack. That takes time. And the main objective of showing you this and telling you this is the business side has to be prepared. It's always a partnership. So the IT folks, the security folks have a role to play, but then the business side also has to be able to survive manually to the greatest extent possible, even if it slows them, even if they're operating slower manually. But they have to be able to do something in parallel while you're doing all of these steps. While you're assessing the backups and doing the forensic investigation, they're not going to just sit around and wait. They're supposed to have their manual processes, and I'll give you some examples of that in a little bit. And so this kind of shows you the current state of things. Why cyber resilience is a thing that we're talking about, with the common delays that come out of it. But what can we do about it? And this is where the planning side comes in, and the whole planning life cycle. There are 4 domains that are in the resilience umbrella. So it's not just business continuity planning. That part refers to how do I continue my business operations? So I lost a supplier, I lost a system, or I lost more traditional things like a building because of a weather or a fire. How do I continue operating? Then there's on the far right, the disaster recovery planning for technologies, which is how do I rebuild my systems? Both of those things are dealing with those 2 types of plans. They're dealing with recovery and resumption. Before that, there's a couple of things that have to happen. The very first one is damage control. So that's where we get into incident response, emergency response, depending on what we're talking about. So if it's like an IT issue, it's an incident. If it's fire, typically it's called an emergency rather than an incident. But it's that immediate damage control, and that needs its own plans as well. And then there's crisis management, which is basically, as those people on the ground are doing their evacuation and everything, what does the management team do? How does the management team get together, talk to the media, manage this as a crisis before we even get to those other 2 types of plans to actually recover and resume operations? A more traditional example that I have for you here is where you would have to use all of these types of plans is, let's say there's a fire or an explosion at the main office site. People are hurt. You have to evacuate people. That's where incident emergency response are triggered. Shortly after, the news finds out, they start to blame the company for being very careless. The management team has to manage this as a crisis because people are hurt. The media is saying stuff about the company. They have to manage the fallout there and direct the recovery effort. And then we get to business continuity, disaster recovery, where the business has to continue operations because you just lost your main building. How do I keep serving my customers from somewhere else? And then also my data center was in that building, so I need my disaster recovery, IT disaster recovery, to rebuild or recover those systems somewhere else. And that's an example of like a combo scenario where all of these are triggered. Same thing with cyber attacks. Major cyber attack, it starts off as a security incident, it grows. The business has to keep working while the systems are not available. The management team has to figure out, was data stolen? If yes, what do we do? What do we communicate? And so all of these 4 fields, all of these different types of plans have different teams executing them, and they all come together depending on how complex the scenario is. And I talked a little bit about crisis management and incident response, and they're typically 2 separate teams. The team that's on the ground, that's doing the damage control, they're in the weeds. At the same time, the management team is doing their part with oversight, trying to figure out, engaging the lawyers, engaging insurance providers. Those 2 teams have to be able to talk because they have the same objective. They're trying to do damage control, contain the issue, contain the fallout, and if they don't talk to each other, it could lead to, one team knows something or has an update for another, and it doesn't help the recovery effort. So how do we approach developing these plans? The plans are not the first step. The plans are towards the end of the life cycle. So I looked at a few different standards, whether it's the ISO standard or different guidelines from the Canadian government and so on, and they all revolve around the same set of steps. It won't be worded the exact same thing if you look at ISO versus something else, but these are the key steps that you have to go through. Starting with the first one, what is the nature of the business? How time sensitive are its operations? Can I slice and dice this business into different processes so that I can assess them, figure out how to recover one by one? That's the first box. The second box, which is probably the one that you've mostly heard of, is the business impact analysis. And this is where we say, okay, if this process doesn't happen, what is the impact? How bad is it? Are lives in danger? Are we going to lose a little bit of money? Is nobody going to notice because it's a strategic type planning service? And you start to divide up the business into departments and their activities into time sensitivity. So sometimes people say, the criticality of a business process, but less criticality makes people feel that their process is not as important. So I'd rather focus on the time sensitivity. So how bad is it? What's the fallout if this doesn't happen in each time frame? These first 2 steps, even if we're talking about cyber resilience, have to be done on the business as a whole, because this is the business requirement. And in the business requirement, if we go and say, your scenario is only cyber attacks, people start to theorize and say, okay, well, I only need like a cell phone for this process, so there's no impact. And we end up with a different set of time sensitivity impacts for those processes. So for the first 2, you have to say, regardless of what type of disruption, how time sensitive is this business process? For the remaining steps, this is where we get to say, okay, I don't have that much capacity to plan for every scenario that I showed you on the list before. I want to focus on cyber attacks, whether it's just against my company, against key vendors. The next 4 steps are, and sometimes those couple of steps are glossed over, which is the risk assessment and the resilience strategy. I find sometimes programs go from, you do the business impact analysis, you have your business requirement, you go straight to developing a plan. But there are prerequisites that you have to have in the plan that could make or break it. So the reason we do a risk assessment is to figure out how exposed are we to these scenarios, especially if we're talking about multiple scenarios. For example, if we're talking about my suppliers getting breached, you slice and dice your suppliers and think about the criticality and how strong they are and what's the likelihood of them being disrupted so that you can prioritize stuff in the next step, which is the strategy. Another example that I'll use here is, let's say we have a remote workforce or remote sites. We're worried about telecommunications disruption because there could be, someone needs to report a safety incident. Maybe we get them satellite phones. And so in the risk assessment, we say, there's a risk of we have a single point of failure on communications. In the strategy, my strategy is I have to go buy and train people on how to use these satellite phones. And then we get to the plan development where we say the satellite phone is on the wall over here. Here's how to use it if communications are disrupted. Same thing with any type of disruption, especially for cyber attacks. There are things that we have to put in place. The easy example is backups. If we just go straight from business impact analysis, my recovery target is 1 day, directly to the plan says go get the backup, but if you don't invest in the right backups, it's not going to help you. And so you have to go through the process of at least having that strategy to say, we need to buy things. We need to put things, whether it's redesigning a process, buying something, setting something up, in order for the plan to succeed. And then we develop those plans, and once we develop them, we train and exercise them to make sure that people know how to use those plans. Zooming in on each of these boxes. So in the business impact analysis, like I was saying, this has to be what we call an all hazards approach, which is, regardless of why you can't do your work, why you can't do this particular business process, such as accepting payments or paying your employees, you can't operate this process. What's the impact? How fast are people going to stop showing up for work? How fast are customers going to go to your competitor if you can't accept payments? And so we divide up the organization into these processes. We have that list, and we assess the impact of them over time to figure out at which point do I, what's my business requirement for recovering this particular process. And risk tolerance comes into play here as well. If you have less risk tolerance, those timeframes are going to be shorter, but then the investment is going to be bigger in making sure that those processes are resilient. The second bit is, what are the resources that I need? So it's not just enough to say, my business impact analysis says 4 hours for that process, or 5 days for my payroll service. What do you need? What's the minimum that you need to make it happen? And when we talk about cyber attacks, we're talking about, I need this particular, my timesheet data, and I need my payroll vendor, my payroll processor. And so that's a vendor and a system, each of which could experience a cyber attack. I need those two to be able to process payroll. A bit of a pitfall, like I was talking about, it should be assessed in an all-hazards scenario, but then when you get to that step of identifying the dependencies, that's when you can, that's the line in the sand where you can say, okay, now we can be specific to the scenario. So I don't need to know which building you process your payroll in, I just need to know what are the technology bits that you need and what are the third parties that you need. There are other types of dependencies like people. This was a big one in the pandemic, like, only this person can approve payroll. If you're doing the broader business resilience, like for that program for the whole company, that's when you get into all the resource types, whether you have like specialized equipment, a specific type of machine, a facility that you need. That's when you would expand it and collect all those resource types. But specifically for cyber resilience, I would say, definitely your systems and data, but also suppliers or third parties, because those companies are not immune as well, or not immune either. A bit of a tip for running the business impact analysis. Sometimes I find people start it from the very back office of the company. They start with IT and all the support functions and say, what's your time sensitivity? But it's very hard for them to answer that because they're a service provider internally to the rest of the company. And so in an example here, I have groups of processes of a typical manufacturer. Let's say you have a factory, you're producing something. you can group it down into, if you start from the end of the process, we have shipping. And typically, that's the easiest one to answer the criticality for, because you have contracts that say you have to ship out the product this fast. You have, before that, warehousing, you know how much inventory you have. So if I stop production for 2 days, I run out of inventory. And so that gives you clear lines in the sand for time sensitivity and how long shipping can be delayed, how long you can stay without your inventory. And you work that backwards towards, well, okay, I have to replenish that inventory. How time sensitive is manufacturing, planning for the production, getting raw materials in the door, and then all the support functions basically inherit those timeframes. So let's say you have a week's worth supply of your products, and then you have to ship out every 2 days. You can focus on making that shipping process more resilient and having that customer information and the routing tables, the routing plans. And then manufacturing can actually survive a few more days longer because you already have that minimum inventory at all times. And you start working backwards, which alleviates some of the pressure on the support functions because they don't have to recover as fast as those processes at the end of the chain. And then we get to exposure. Assessing the exposure, which is basically the same step as the risk assessment. So we just talked about, slicing and dicing the organization, assessing the time sensitivity, figuring out the dependencies. Now that I have all of this as the business requirement, how exposed are my assets? So I depend on this system, internal system, I depend on this outsourced external system, I depend on this particular third party. You would look at it and say, okay, step one, identify the threats, to each of those assets, mapping that, these assets are supporting those 5 processes. What are the safeguards I have in place so that I can start by investing in the most exposed assets? And then figuring out a plan, which is the strategy on what to do about it. An example of things to look at, if we're talking about an internal system, you can actually do some scoring for all of these things. So if a system is used across the whole company, the risk score for it goes up, and therefore it's more important, more business critical. If the current recovery capabilities are low, the risk score goes up because the system is now more exposed. If I have manual alternative, the risk score goes down because I can make do without the system. Similarly, if we look at third parties, do I have contractual safeguards that push the third party to give me an exercise result every year, showing that they do have these resilience capabilities in place, that they have their own disaster recovery in place? Do they have a good track record? Because if they have a bad track record, their risk goes up and they need more attention. They need more of your time to either plan around them being disrupted or being able to help them figure out how to become more resilient. The example that I'll use here is, for the last criteria, the availability of alternatives. How difficult is it for me to switch suppliers? I had a client that was in the manufacturing industry, and they only had 2 suppliers that could service them for starch. And what does starch have to do with IT? Not much, but it's a company that gives them a raw material, and if that company can't do their production, if that company gets breached, all of my client's production would stop. And the alternatives in the market, well, there were only 2 of these producers, and it was already starch. For those of you manufacturing, you would have known that starch is in high demand, and so it's not very easy to replace them. And so that can't be my strategy. My strategy has to be focused on, well, do I stockpile more starch in my factories, or can I work with the supplier to make sure that their process is more resilient to cyber attacks because they're a critical supplier? When developing a strategy, there are 3 pieces to look at. As we talk about typically prevention, we don't want the cyber attack to happen in the first place, but if it does, we have to have response plans in place as well, and that's where we develop the plans. And then recovery capabilities, you need to have the prerequisites, such as good backups, tested backups, to be able to do that response. On the prevention side, this is all the typical security guidelines on segment. Make sure that you you reduce your attack surface. All of these typical security guidelines to make sure that the breach doesn't happen in the first place. That's pretty interrelated with a resilience strategy, and so you don't really have to double up. But if you identify more exposures, that's when there's overlap with a typical security strategy. In the middle part, that's where planning comes into place. So we want to make sure that we're ready to respond when a cyber attack does happen. And on the recovery side, this is where, how do we activate manual workarounds? Do we reallocate personnel? Do I get temporary staff to help me with manual processes, making the decision to rebuild systems, and all the prerequisites? And all of this has to be addressed in the strategy. So if I have a lot of gaps around recovery, that's where the strategy would focus. there's the concept of two safety nets. And I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about the business side, the business operations side has to do something. If you think about it, resilience in two safety nets, the first one is, the systems are not available. Can the business keep going manually? The second safety net is recovering the systems. And we always want to have redundancy in our controls. We don't want to have a single point of failure in those controls. And so in the first one, you can have, depending on the type of operation, you can have paper forms, you can have different there's a whack load of alternatives for being able to do something manually. Even if it's manufacturing, there's machinery that can run manually. You can print manually your labels and stick them on the products if you have a pre-built template. And so there's the whole first safety net of the business has a responsibility to be able to survive at least a day or two, for example, after a cyber attack. And in the meantime, at the same time, the second safety net is all the IT and security folks working on quarantining, investigating, and bringing back those systems. And both of them work together at the same time. Nobody should be sitting around and doing nothing. There's always a piece to do under those two safety nets. There's also the concept of a couple of big red buttons. And I take this from a previous client. They were asking me, is there a big red button I can just push and it does something and it saves me? And while that doesn't really exist, there's a couple of ideas that came up out of that conversation where I think they're worth mentioning. The first one is the concept of site survival. And the idea here is that, especially for if you have a lot of branches or if you have a big geographic footprint or your network has a big footprint, the concept of isolating an infected part of the network. So we talk a lot about segmentation, but you can't always segment everything so that it doesn't talk to each other at all. Wouldn't it be great if you had a button that you can push that says, this branch has been infected, just chop off their access so that they can't infect and spread to the rest of the rest of the corporation, the rest of the network body. We ended up establishing basically a protocol where if one of my clients' factories if they detect a cyber attack in one of them, they would basically turn off the connection, and if it was in the head office, they would basically terminate the connections with all of their factories so that even though corporate is experiencing a cyber attack and it's the most important ERP system, there's a protocol manually for how the factories can continue to do their thing, survive as a site, without the support of head office for several days. The other concept or the other big red button is alternative communications. In several cyber attacks, you see communications are compromised, email, the attackers have access to your email, and so you need a way to coordinate, to be able to notify people, issue instructions out of band. So you can use cell phones if it's a small group of people. If it's a bigger group of people, there are services out there that are completely out of band, not connected to your network, that help you communicate with a mass group of people. So we talked about doing the risk assessment. You have your business requirement, assess the risk, develop a strategy. Then we get to the planning. And sometimes I see plans that go straight to the procedure. So, it's a checklist or, 1, 2, 3, do these things. But there are more things that are needed in a plan. Setting the context and scope of a plan, the authority to activate the plan, because sometimes activating the plan has a financial impact. There's a cost with dropping what you're doing and switching to this temporary mode of operations. Roles and responsibilities so that you know who's responsible for what, for doing which part and executing which part so that, we're not running around as headless chickens. The required communications, so not just like the sort of the minimums, but what are the communications channels? So when the plan is activated, the person occupying this role or filling this role has to notify these people. This person goes and talks to the media. This person does this and that. And so you need to have, and what are the approved channels to do that? And then we get to the detailed recovery procedures, which is the bulk of the plan, which is where you say, step one, the systems are not available, so grab the printed forms or the printed whatever it is that you need to do and start operating that way. And here's a guideline on how you operate that way. Sometimes I see plans that say, here's a list of all the alternatives that are available, but that doesn't help staff select. So if they were sequenced, it would work. But sometimes I see plans that just say, here's a list of 15 things that 10 different ways that you could communicate or 12 different things that you could do. And that sometimes confuses people because they don't know what to pick first. So the protocol has to be, if this is the scenario, this system is down, here's what you can do. And then we have a bunch of appendices that have to go in the plan to help people with anything that's pre-built. So whether it's a form that needs to be filled out with multiple copies, any type of extra guideline, contact information, all of that would go in the printed plan or the offline plan. And then once we have the plans, and we talked about there are different types of plans. So there are business continuity plans, crisis management plans. They follow a similar structure. How do I activate the plan? How do I declare a crisis, declare an incident? And you would go through the same things, and you have communications, you have roles and responsibilities. So they would look and feel the same. It's just the actual protocol that's in them that's different. And then we get to the last part before maintenance. It's the training and exercising. And I'm not going to read all of these for you, but there are a ton of benefits to being able to do training and exercising. We want to make sure that, now that we documented a plan, typically plans are developed with a small group of people, but it's a much broader group of people that have to follow them. So if you look at the roles and responsibilities, it's typically it has more people listed there than the people that were involved in developing the plan. And so we have to explain it to them, walk them through it, and then give them a safe environment to practice the plan and be able to run through and figure out what's expected of them. And because a lot of the time they're experts in their areas of operations, they would be able to raise issues and to say, that template is wrong, the way that you have the order of the steps is wrong, I have to do this before that. And that really helps you establish a really solid plan. Couple more comments on how to put it all together. So just some closing thoughts that didn't really fit any particular place in the presentation. Keeping the business involved. So even though we're talking about cyber attacks, half of the fight is how is the business going to survive while IT and security are working on recovering and containing that cyber attack. So typically business resilience is a business-wide responsibility. It's not the CISO or the head of security that's supposed to be responsible for it. Cyber resilience is usually tagged to the security person, but half of it is the business. The business has to do their recovery planning, and it's not the IT folks that will know what the best manual workaround is going to be. So it has to be a joint effort. The second one is keeping it practical. So we're talking about survival mode. We're not trying to duplicate and create a copy paste of the company. We're trying to do the bare minimum to survive, the bare minimum to make sure that the company stays in business. And then we slowly expand on that. As you continue to mature, you can do more and more so that you're not doing the absolute bare minimum. You're doing a bit more in terms of the level of operation in recovery mode. Understand the appetite for investment. So this is a good one to have up front because sometimes we develop resilience strategies and we go in at the end and we understand that there's no budget or there's like a really tiny budget. And so it doesn't really help you because you picked a bunch of things that need to be done, but they can't prioritize because they don't want to spend that much on it or they didn't have that much reserved for it. And so that would have helped before you develop a strategy so that you can pick more cost-effective methods to do. Maybe if it takes longer, if the recovery time frame needs to be longer, it's helpful to know the appetite upfront. Investing across the life cycle, so not just focusing on preventing cyber attacks and making sure they never happen, and then not focusing on what happens after a cyber attack hits. We have to focus on the response itself and the recovery as well across the life cycle, and then looking at where we're less mature and bringing that up first. The next one is looking outside the box, so not just thinking outside the box, but not just looking at a company as an island. No company just operate, or very limited organizations operate purely on their own. There's always a supplier, a third party that you're depending on. If you look at bigger corporations, they use thousands of suppliers. A few percentages of those suppliers are the really critical ones. Those are the ones that you would focus on when assessing the risk of third parties. But always look at your ecosystem, not just your own company. And then the last one is collaborate with your industry. So a lot of industries are pretty friendly. They'll with other players in the same industry, they'll collaborate, go through industry associations. Recovering a particular manufacturing process, recovering an administrative process, recovering systems, it sometimes looks similar across similar companies. The example that I'll use is schools, a high school. The recovery process for a high school, or if you take 20 high schools, you're not going to have 20 different recovery plans or business continuity plans. They're going to look the same. And so it's beneficial for those group of schools to get together and plan together, or at least share ideas, because the recovery looks pretty similar. The last thing that I'll leave you with is a bit of a call to action. So I have 4 questions for you to think about. Think about your critical service providers. So what's the number one most critical service provider that you have? And if that service provider, no matter how big or small they are, if they're breached, can you survive for a week or 2 without them? Because that's happened in a lot of cases, and you'll find plenty of news stories where a particular company couldn't operate for a week or 2. And so can you withstand that kind of disruption for any company out there? I'm not saying all your service providers will be breached at the same time, but pick one and see what would happen in that one. The second one is think about your payroll. Whether it's the particular bank that you're working with, whether it's the payroll provider. If you don't make payroll, how fast are people, and it's the day before payroll, there's a breach, how fast are people going to stop showing up for work? There are some businesses where people would keep coming for a month. There are some businesses where 3 days and they're going to stop. And that has a much bigger impact on the business. Think about your damage control. So how confident are we that we will detect a cyber attack early, and that we can have the right containment, and that we know how to quarantine an attack before it spreads? And then think about your recovery. How fast can I rebuild my systems, especially in the scenario of a cyber attack where the primary infrastructure, the primary assets are off limits because the forensics people are doing their part. And so I just wanted to leave you with that. I promised you I would bring up the not suspicious QR code again. I'm kidding. It just goes to LinkedIn, but I welcome your questions. Awesome.